They mocked a pregnant woman with a broken man, but he gave his life to heal her. In a small town, life seemed to move at a steady pace, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It wasn't much different from any other rural community, where the roads were dusty and the houses were far apart. The people here had always lived their lives the same way, generation after generation. They had their own unspoken rules, their own small-town gossip, and their own way of looking at the world. But to anyone who wasn't born and raised here, it felt like a place where no one could escape judgment. Lena, a woman in her late 20s, was not born in this town. She came from somewhere else, a life she preferred to forget. Her pregnancy, which seemed to have arrived out of nowhere, became the talk of the town. She hadn't planned for this life, and the weight of it all pressed down on her every day. Alone and pregnant, Lena wandered the streets, feeling like an outsider. The people in the town saw her as just another mistake, someone who didn't belong. For months, Lena had kept her head down, trying to avoid the stares and whispers. She knew they all talked behind her back, judged her silently as they passed her in the street. To them, she was nothing more than a broken woman, someone who had made poor choices in life. But inside her, she was fighting a battle no one could see. She had tried to stand tall, tried to face the world with a sense of pride. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of their judgment always followed her like a shadow. Then there was him. Jake had been a man who was once known for his strength. He was the kind of person who could lift a heavy load without breaking a sweat, but after an accident several years ago, his body was never the same. A fall from a high place had left him with permanent damage to his legs. He couldn't walk like he used to, couldn't work the way he had before. The man who was once the strongest in town had become a shadow of himself. The town looked at him differently, too. They didn't see the man they once admired. Instead, they saw only his weakness, his limitations. And for Jake, that was the hardest part to bear. He spent most of his days alone, sitting by the window of his small house, watching life pass him by. The pain in his legs was constant, but it was the pain in his heart that hurt the most. He used to be someone people turned to for help, but now, no one came to visit. He had no one to talk to, no one to share his frustrations with. The loneliness was suffocating. Jake had built walls around himself, walls that no one could get through. He convinced himself that he was better off alone, that no one could understand his pain. But deep down he wished someone would try. One day, while sitting on his front porch, he saw her. Lena was walking down the dusty road, her hands resting on the small bump of her pregnancy. She was alone, as usual, and seemed to be lost in her thoughts. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of the world, and Jake couldn't help but notice the sadness in her eyes. It was a sadness he recognized too well. It was the same sadness that had taken root in his heart years ago. He didn't know why, but something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the sight of her vulnerability. Maybe it was the way the world had treated her. But Jake felt compelled to do something. He knew what it was like to feel alone, to feel like no one cared, and for the first time in a long while he wanted to help someone. Jake didn't think about it much. He just knew that he had to do something. Slowly he stood up from his porch, his legs aching with every step. He walked down to the road where Lena was walking, his heart pounding in his chest. She didn't notice him at first, so lost in her own world. But as he came closer, she looked up. Her eyes were filled with surprise, and for a brief moment, they locked. "I know it's hard," Jake said, his voice rough from disuse. "But you're not alone." She had never expected anyone, let alone a man like him, to say something like that. She had heard nothing but judgment and silence from everyone in the town, and now this man was offering her a kind word. It caught her off guard. "Thank you," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure what else to say. She had never been good at accepting kindness, but there was something about Jake that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. Jake offered her a small, shy smile, then turned to walk alongside her. They didn't speak for a while, but the silence was comfortable. For the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel like an outcast. She wasn't sure why, but Jake made her feel seen, in a way that no one else had. Over the next few days, their paths crossed more often. Jake would come out of his house to find Lena walking down the same road, her hands resting on her belly. She seemed to walk slower, with a weariness that came from carrying more than just the weight of her pregnancy. Jake started to walk with her, offering his quiet company. They didn't talk much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, they both found comfort in the presence of another person. The townspeople began to notice. They couldn't ignore the sight of Jake, the broken man, walking alongside the pregnant woman who had been the subject of so much gossip. Their whispers started to grow louder. People couldn't understand it. Why would Jake, of all people, be spending time with someone like her? To them, it didn't make sense. They were too quick to judge, too eager to spread their opinions. Some even mocked Jake for his kindness, calling him foolish. They didn't understand what he saw in her. They didn't understand the connection that had formed between two broken souls. But Jake didn't care about their judgment. In Lena, he saw something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. A glimmer of hope. She was strong, in her own quiet way. And for the first time, Jake felt like he might have something to offer again. He wasn't just a broken man anymore. He was someone who could help. As the days turned into weeks, Lena began to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The weight of the judgment from the town still lingered, but it wasn't as heavy when Jake was with her. She had never asked for his help, never expected anyone to show her kindness. But Jake did, and it meant more than she could put into words. She didn't know how much longer she could keep carrying the burden of her pregnancy, but with Jake by her side, she felt like maybe she could manage. And for the first time in a long time, Lena smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was real. A small moment of light in a world that had often felt dark. As she walked down that same dusty road, with Jake at her side, she realized that maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Days passed, and as time went on, Lena and Jake's quiet bond grew stronger. They were no longer strangers who shared a passing glance. Their brief moments of silence turned into long walks, where they would talk about things they hadn't shared with anyone else. Lena found herself telling Jake things she never thought she'd say to another person, let alone someone she barely knew. Her voice would tremble at first, but there was something about Jake's presence that made her feel safe. Maybe it was the way he listened, without judgment, or how he never interrupted when she spoke. His silence didn't feel awkward. It was comfortable, as if it gave her space to be herself. Jake, on the other hand, had found a kind of peace in Lena's company that he hadn't felt in years. His own life had been a series of battles, against pain, against loneliness, and against the way people saw him. But with Lena, he didn't feel like he was a broken man anymore. She didn't treat him like he was useless or weak, as others did. Instead, she treated him with the same quiet kindness that he showed her. The way she looked at him sometimes made him wonder if she saw something more than the man who couldn't walk the way he used to. It made him feel, for the first time in years, that maybe he was worth something. Lena had often thought about the way the town had treated her. She knew they talked behind her back, whispering about her pregnancy, about her past. It was a burden she had carried with her everywhere, the weight of their judgment pressing down harder than the physical strain of carrying a child. She had tried to block it out, to ignore their whispers and stares, but it was impossible. No matter how much she wanted to move forward, their voices always seemed to follow her. The loneliness had become suffocating. It wasn't just that no one offered help or support. It was that no one cared to understand her situation. When Jake first started walking with her, she hadn't known what to expect. Part of her had been afraid of letting someone else in, afraid of becoming vulnerable again. But as the days passed, she began to look forward to their walks. She found herself opening up to Jake in ways she hadn't even realized she could. She spoke about her childhood, the mistakes she had made, and how she had ended up here, in this small town, pregnant and alone. She didn't sugarcoat anything. There was no need to pretend with Jake. He wasn't there to judge her or give advice he didn't understand. He was simply there. But even as she grew closer to Jake, a part of Lena still held back. She was afraid. Afraid that this kindness, this connection they were building, wouldn't last. She knew that people like Jake and herself weren't meant to have happy endings. Life had shown her that much. Every time she thought she had found something good, it slipped away from her fingers. But Jake seemed different. He didn't make her feel like she was a burden. When he looked at her, it wasn't with pity or sympathy. He looked at her like she was someone worth saving, someone worth caring for. Jake, too, struggled with his own doubts. His legs still ached with every step, and the pain in his body was something he had learned to live with. But the pain in his heart was harder to bear. He had spent years pushing people away, convincing himself that no one wanted to be around someone as broken as him. His friends had disappeared after his accident, and the town had started seeing him as nothing more than a man who couldn't contribute. The world had told him that he was no longer useful, that he had nothing to offer. But Lena saw something in him that no one else had. Draven, she saw him as a man who had been crippled by an accident. She saw him as someone who could help her, someone who could be there when no one else would. Despite the growing bond between them, the town's judgment never stopped. People continued to talk, continued to gossip, continued to criticize the fact that Jake was helping Lena. They didn't understand why he would choose to spend his time with her. To them, she was a symbol of weakness, someone who had made bad decisions. And Jake, well, he was the same. His injury had made him weak in their eyes, and his kindness toward Lena only added to their confusion. The whispers followed them wherever they went. Sometimes Lena would catch a glimpse of someone shaking their head as she walked down the road with Jake. The words they spoke were never kind, never understanding. It wasn't just that they didn't like her. They didn't like the fact that someone like Jake, who was supposed to be an example of failure, was helping her. They didn't see it as an act of kindness. They saw it as a mistake, as something that didn't belong in their perfect little world. But Jake didn't care. He didn't care what the town thought. And he didn't care what anyone else said. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something right. He had stopped listening to the voices of others, stopped letting their opinions shape how he saw the world. Lena had become his priority, not because he pitied her, but because he understood her pain. And in that understanding, he found purpose again. He found the strength to keep moving, not for himself, but for her. Lena, though, was still struggling. She knew she couldn't change the way the town saw her. She couldn't erase the mistakes she had made or the judgments they had already cast upon her. But what Jake had given her, the gift of being seen, was something she would hold on to for as long as she could. She didn't know how long this bond would last, but she knew that for this brief moment in time she was no longer invisible. She had someone who cared about her, someone who didn't look at her with disdain. It was a small, simple thing, but it meant the world to Lena. No one had ever shown her kindness like this before. No one had ever walked alongside her without expecting something in return. Jake wasn't asking for anything. He was simply there. And that was all she needed. In the quiet of their walks, with the sun setting behind them, Lena began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. It was a small light flickering in the darkness, but it was a light nonetheless. And with Jake beside her, it felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her after all. As the days turned into weeks, Lena and Jake continued to spend more time together. The quiet moments they shared began to weave a connection that neither of them had expected. It wasn't the kind of friendship that was formed out of convenience or pity. It was a bond that grew naturally, as if the universe had somehow brought them together to heal each other in ways they couldn't have imagined. There was no rush, no need to put a label on what they were building. They simply enjoyed each other's company, and that was enough. For Lena, this was a first. She had spent most of her life trying to avoid others, trying to keep herself hidden from the judgment and whispers of the world. But with Jake, there was no need to hide. He didn't ask questions about her past, nor did he try to fix her. He simply accepted her as she was, a woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, but still doing her best to survive. He didn't see the mistakes she had made or the things she regretted. He just saw Lena, and that was something she had never experienced before. Jake, on the other hand, had always kept people at arm's length. His accident had left him feeling like a burden, and the people around him seemed to reinforce that feeling. He wasn't the same man he had been before. His legs hurt, and his body didn't work the way it used to. He had been ashamed of his limitations for so long that he had convinced himself he wasn't worth anyone's time. But Lena didn't treat him like that. She didn't pity him, and she certainly didn't see him as a burden. She looked at him as though he still had something to offer the world. The more time they spent together, the more they both began to heal. Jake felt like he was starting to find his purpose again. Helping Lena gave him a reason to get out of bed every day. She made him feel useful, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The pain in his legs still throbbed, but it didn't feel quite as heavy when he was with her. Every small gesture, whether it was holding her hand during one of their walks or carrying her groceries, made him feel like he was part of something bigger than himself. He had thought that his usefulness had ended when his accident occurred. But now, with Lena by his side, he began to see that maybe he still had something to give. For Lena, each passing day was a small step toward healing. She had lived with the constant weight of judgment, and it had made her believe that she wasn't worthy of kindness. She had accepted that she was broken, that she was the sum of her mistakes. But Jake showed her a different way to look at herself. He didn't see her as someone who had made mistakes. He saw her as someone who was simply trying to live, trying to make the best of a difficult situation. He never asked her to explain herself or to justify her past. He was just there. And that was enough. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, Lena and Jake found themselves walking in comfortable silence. The air was warm, and the world around them seemed to be at peace. They had been walking together for months now, and it had become a routine. But that day, something felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a realization that they had both found something in each other that they hadn't known they were looking for. Lena looked up at Jake, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had never been the kind of person to express her feelings easily, but with Jake, she felt like she didn't have to hide her emotions. She could be herself, without fear of judgment or rejection. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything." Jake glanced at her, his face showing a rare moment of vulnerability. He wasn't used to being thanked. He had always been the one to give, to help, but it wasn't often that someone acknowledged his efforts. Yet with Lena, it didn't feel like a big deal. It felt natural, like part of what they were building together. "You don't have to thank me," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "I'm just doing what anyone else would do." Lena shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "No, Jake. You're not just anyone else. You're here when no one else is. You've done more for me than anyone ever has." Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. It was the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Maybe longer. Lena's gratitude wasn't something he had expected, but it was something he needed. It made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since his accident, Jake didn't feel like he was invisible. He didn't feel like he was just a broken man trying to get by. With Lena, he felt like he had value again. The more they talked, the more they began to open up to each other about things they had never shared before. Lena spoke about her childhood, about the pain of losing her family, and the mistakes she had made in her younger years. She had never told anyone these things, not even her closest friends. But with Jake, there was no need to hide. He didn't judge her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was being weighed down by the shame of her past. Jake, too, began to share more of his own story. He talked about his life before the accident, about how he had been the one everyone turned to when they needed help. He had been strong, confident, and proud, but that man was gone now, replaced by someone who felt small and invisible. Lena listened without interruption, without pity. She simply listened, and that was all he needed. As their relationship deepened, they began to rely on each other in ways they hadn't expected. Jake helped Lena with things she couldn't do on her own, like lifting heavy bags or fixing things around the house. Lena, in turn, became Jake's emotional anchor. She reminded him of who he had been before the accident, and she made him believe that he could still find his way back to that person. Together they had found something special, a friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. But the town still hadn't changed. They still whispered behind Lena's back, still cast judgment on Jake for helping her. It seemed that no matter how much they tried to distance themselves from the negativity, it followed them like a shadow. But neither of them cared. They had each other, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. One evening, as the sky turned pink and the stars began to appear, Lena and Jake sat on a bench near the edge of town. It was their favorite spot, the one place where they could sit in peace without anyone bothering them. The air was cool, and the sounds of crickets filled the silence. "I used to think I was invisible," Lena said, her voice soft, "like no one could see me, no matter how hard I tried. But now, I feel different."
Like I matter. Like I'm not alone anymore.
Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You matter to me, Lena. You always have."
Her heart skipped a beat at his words. For the first time, she believed him.
She didn't just feel like she mattered to him. She felt like she mattered to the world, and that was something she hadn't felt in a long time. As the night grew darker and the stars sparkled above them, Lena and Jake sat in comfortable silence. They didn't need to say anything more. The bond they had formed through pain and struggle was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. For the first time in her life, Lena didn't feel like a broken woman. She felt like someone who was worthy of love, worthy of kindness. And Jake, though still broken in his own way, had given her the greatest gift of all. He had shown her that she was not invisible. She was seen. And in that moment, that was enough. One day, the weather had taken a turn. It was the kind of day when the sky darkened early and the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees and sending leaves spinning through the air. Lena had been feeling restless all morning. It wasn't unusual for her to feel a little uneasy as her pregnancy continued. But today was different. She couldn't quite put her finger on why, but there was something unsettling about the way the wind howled, the way the sky had darkened so quickly. Jake had noticed her unease too. He knew her better than anyone now, and he could sense that something wasn't right. He had become more attuned to her moods, watching how her eyes seemed a little more distant, how her movements were slower than usual. He hadn't said anything about it at first, not wanting to add to her worries. But as the afternoon stretched on and the storm clouds gathered, he couldn't ignore it any longer. "Lena," he said gently, his voice almost lost in the wind. "You okay?" She looked up at him, offering a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just feeling a little off today," she admitted, trying to shake the feeling that had settled deep in her chest. "I think it's just the weather. I'm sure it'll pass." Jake didn't seem convinced. He stepped closer, his limp more pronounced as he moved against the gusting wind. The pain in his legs had worsened with the change in weather, but he pushed through it, as he always did. He couldn't help but worry. Something about the storm, about the way Lena's face seemed drawn, told him that it wasn't just the weather bothering her.
"If you're feeling unsure about anything, we can go inside," Jake suggested, trying to keep his voice steady even though he too was feeling the weight of the moment.
"You don't need to be out here if it's making you uncomfortable." Lena hesitated, glancing up at the sky as if she were waiting for something, for a sign that things would settle. She was about to say something when a sudden sharp pain shot through her lower back. It took her by surprise, and her breath caught in her throat. She winced, a wave of discomfort sweeping over her. Jake's eyes widened in alarm as he reached out to steady her. "Lena, what is it?" he asked, his voice rising with concern. Lena shook her head, trying to mask the panic that was beginning to rise in her chest.
"I'm fine."
"It's just my back. It happens sometimes. I'm sure it's nothing." But Jake wasn't convinced. He could see the way her face had paled, the way her breath came quicker. He knew that something more serious was happening. She wasn't the type to overreact or make a big deal out of anything, and if she was acting like this, it meant that something was wrong. I know it's not just your back, he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. I can see it in your eyes. For a moment, Lena just stood there, leaning against him, trying to catch her breath. The pain had grown sharper, more intense, and she realized with a jolt that it wasn't just discomfort, it was a warning. The baby was coming. She hadn't expected it this soon, and panic began to claw at her throat. She hadn't prepared for this. She wasn't ready. The storm was only getting worse, the wind howling around them, and she was far from help. Jake must have seen the fear flash across her face because without another word, he scooped her up in his arms. His legs burned with pain, but he didn't care. Lena needed him. She needed help, and he wasn't going to let her face this alone. He moved quickly, carefully, though his own body protested with every step. He knew they had to get to the house, that it was the only place they could find shelter from the storm. The wind whipped around them, making it difficult to see as Jake made his way back toward the house. Lena's pain continued to increase, and she clung to him, her fingers digging into his jacket as she fought to remain calm. She couldn't understand how this was happening. The baby wasn't due for weeks. Why was it coming now? Was everything going to be okay? Jake didn't say anything, just kept his focus on the path ahead. He had never been so sure of anything in his life. His mind was focused entirely on getting her inside, getting her somewhere safe. Every painful step he took was for her. She couldn't do this alone. She shouldn't have to. When they finally reached the house, Jake rushed inside, his legs shaking from the effort, but he didn't stop. He carried Lena carefully to the small bedroom, setting her down on the bed as gently as he could. The pain on Lena's face was clear now. Every contraction, every twist in her body showed the urgency of the situation. She had no choice but to face the fear she had pushed down for so long. "Jake, I don't know what to do," she said through gritted teeth, her voice shaky with pain. Jake knelt beside her, trying to remain calm despite the terror that gripped his own chest. He had never felt more helpless in his life. But he couldn't show that to Lena. She needed him to be strong. She needed him to be the calm in the storm. "We're going to be okay," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." The storm outside seemed to rage harder, the wind howling louder as if to match the chaos unfolding inside. But Jake remained by Lena's side, holding her hand as she breathed through the pain. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't equipped to handle this kind of situation. But he had one thing that mattered more than anything else. He had love. He had a promise to keep. He had vowed to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that vow now. For what felt like hours, the two of them fought together. Lena gripped Jake's hand, pushing through the pain with every ounce of strength she had left. She had no idea how she was still standing, but the thought of her baby, the thought of this new life that was coming into the world, kept her going. She couldn't give up now. She couldn't let herself be afraid. And then, finally, there was silence. The storm outside seemed to calm as quickly as it had begun, and the room was filled with the soft cry of a newborn. Lena collapsed back into the bed, exhausted and trembling, but the sound of the baby's first cry filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The pain had passed, and in its place, there was something new, something beautiful. Jake's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at the tiny bundle in Lena's arms. He had never known such joy, such relief. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at the child they had both worked so hard to bring into the world. And in that moment, everything else, the storm, the pain, the fear, disappeared. It was just them. Just the three of them. Back her face flushed with exhaustion and joy. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded, his own voice choked with tears.
"We did."
And as the storm passed, leaving behind a peaceful quiet, the three of them sat together in the warmth of the small room, safe and sound, knowing that they had survived something they never thought they could, together. As the days passed, a sense of calm settled over the small house where Jake and Lena had found their new beginning. The storm that had once raged outside seemed to have cleared, leaving behind clear skies and a world that felt fresh and full of possibility. But for Lena and Jake, the real storm had only just begun. They had faced so many challenges together already, and the arrival of their child had brought with it a new chapter in their lives, one they were eager to embrace, despite the uncertainty that still lingered. The baby, a beautiful girl with dark eyes and soft skin, had changed everything. The quiet house, once filled with only the sound of the wind and the occasional footsteps of Jake as he moved through the rooms, was now filled with the soft cooing of the newborn. Lena couldn't help but smile every time she looked at her daughter, a child who had brought so much light into her life. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lena felt complete. She felt like she had a purpose, a reason to keep going each day. Jake, too, had found a new sense of joy in the days that followed the baby's birth. He had always been a man who had struggled with the idea of his own worth, but now, holding his daughter in his arms, he realized that he had something to offer the world after all. He wasn't just the broken man the town had labeled him as. He was a father, a protector, and a partner in the truest sense. He had something to give to this new family, and it filled him with a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in years. Despite the happiness that came with the baby's arrival, the town still hadn't let go of its judgments. Lena had known that they would never fully accept her, that they would always look at her and Jake with skepticism, but it still stung. The whispers behind her back hadn't stopped. The looks of disapproval still followed her wherever she went. She had hoped that with the arrival of the baby the town might soften, that they might see the family they had built and understand that they weren't the broken people they had once thought them to be. But that hope quickly faded. Jake had always been the target of the town's cruel words, but now with the baby in the picture, Lena found herself facing judgment as well. People whispered about her, questioning how she could have a child with a man like Jake. They didn't understand the love they shared, the bond they had built through everything they had been through. They didn't see the quiet moments they had shared, the way they had supported each other through every challenge, every obstacle. They didn't see the way Jake held their daughter in his arms with such tenderness, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. All they saw was a pregnant woman and a man who couldn't walk the way he used to. It was a hard truth to swallow, and there were days when Lena felt the weight of it more than others. She couldn't escape the judgment, no matter how hard she tried. But there was one thing she had learned over the past few months. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need the town's approval. All she needed was Jake, and now, their daughter. Together they had built a life, and that was all that mattered. Jake, too, had come to terms with the judgment they both faced. In the beginning it had bothered him. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove that he was more than the broken man people saw, but the more he tried to change their minds, the more he felt like he was failing. But now with Lena and their baby he realized something important. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need the town's acceptance or validation. He had his family, and that was more than enough. Every day as they moved through their routine, Jake and Lena grew more and more in love with the life they were building together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and fear, but they faced them together. And that was something neither of them had ever had before. Someone who would stand by them, no matter what. One evening, after a long day of caring for the baby and taking care of the house, Jake and Lena sat on the porch, watching the sunset. It was one of their favorite times of day, when the world seemed to slow down and everything felt peaceful. The baby was sleeping inside, and for a brief moment they had the chance to relax, to just be. "I never thought I'd get to have a moment like this," Lena said softly, her voice filled with contentment. "I never thought I'd have a family. I thought I was broken beyond repair." Jake reached over and took her hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze.
"We're not broken, Lena. We're just rebuilding. And we're doing it together." Lena smiled at his words, her heart swelling with emotion.
She had spent so many years feeling lost, unsure of who she was or what she was meant to do. But now, with Jake by her side and their daughter in their arms, she felt like she had found her place in the world. She was exactly where she was meant to be. For the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. She didn't feel like the woman the town had once judged. the woman who had made mistakes and had been left to carry the consequences. She was more than that. She was a mother, a partner, and a woman who had found love in the most unexpected of places. Jake, too, had found his place. He wasn't the man he had been before his accident, but that didn't matter anymore. He was still the same person in many ways, kind, strong, and willing to do whatever it took to protect the ones he loved. But now he had found something that gave him purpose again. He had found a family, and he would do anything to keep them safe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land, Jake and Lena sat in silence, simply enjoying the moment. They didn't need to say anything more. They had found each other in the midst of their pain, and together they had built something beautiful. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in both of their lives, they knew that they were exactly where they needed to be. And so, they sat together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next, together, as a family.